за підтримки Львівської міської ради, Міжнародного фонду відродження, Фундації стратегічних змін, Gem Factory, а також Гарольд Біндер Culture Enterprises та Кредо банку. Сьогоднішній день називається «Співжиття». Співжиття, чому так і життя ми визначили з великої букви? Тому що для того, аби мати майбутнє, треба розуміти, що ми робимо сьогодні, для того, щоб це майбутнє було завтра. Ми не здатні контролювати минуле. Ми сьогодні прагнемо зрозуміти теперішнє, аби мати майбутнє. Сьогодні у нас буде з вами декілька різних форматів, не лише публічні дискусії, але без них теж ніяк. І заохочую вас звернути увагу, що події будуть іти одна за одною, без перерв на каву. Лише о 2-й годині у нас годинна перерва. Тому щиро запрошую бути максимально тут, бути максимально з нами, бо зрештою, власне, співжиття так і твориться в фізичній близькості, в наших рефлексіях.
Музиканта, актора, який взяв і помер у Харкові 11 жовтня, не доживши місяця до 50 років. Чортів рок-н-рольщик. Знаєте, Місько, крім того, що людиною був дуже доброю, був людиною дуже мудрою і ціннісною. Мабуть, людина живе доти, доки живуть її ідеї, її прагнення, її етика. І, власне, чому монологи про найважливіше? Та тому, що це про всіх нас, про цей наш такий недоплеканий, але з біса родючий степ української культури. Вчора моя молодша менеджерка подавалася на стипендію імені Марика Івашішина, ще одного такого стовпа, який теж, на жаль, рано відійшов. І дійшовши до питання про те, чому, власне, ви займаєтеся культурою, сказала, а що я їм можу тут сказати, окрім як процитувати монологи про найважливіше. Там все. Тому що слухайте, пам'ятайте. Дякую.
Монолог про найважливіше. Bad company. Грицько. Як усі тенори, педераст. Іван. Бонвіван, франкмасон, фармазон. Тарас. Пияк і шланг, особливо на службі. Панько. Графоман, а Марко гермафродит. Панас мудодзвін, Борис буквоїд, Якович атеїст, кінчений духовидець, Леська і Олька лесбіянки.
Що й казати, паскудне товариство. Але в 20 столітті картина має ще гірший вигляд. Павло Григорович – істинний сковородинець, так само тенор, арфістка. Максим Тадейович мало що балабол, то ще й поляк. Бажан – жид, Фітільов – кацап, Мовчу про Бургарта і Йогансена. Микола Зеров був би нічого, тільки от зуби зіпсовані. Інженер Маланюк з кадетською виправкою, прямий, як єдина звивина. Доктор Донцов ще пряміший, з руками чистими навіть після гри в карти. Доктор Кандиба – розвідник надр. Доктор Петров – просто розвідник. Потім ще пару чекістів, 2-3 комуняки, десяток академіків і на випередки, хто кого швидше здасть.
Самовбивць замало, як на велику літературу. Ну та нічого.
Література могла бути іншою, казав мій приятель. Але дивися, хто це робив. Виключно живі люди, невдахи, пристосуванці, мученики. Самі тобі зболені, хворі, скулені. Саме тобі обскубане птаство, підбите, не літаючи, бідне. Література не могла бути іншою. Слава Богу, що дав нам саме таку, небораками писану.
Обличчя перекошене, піт на скронях, сухість у роті, запах сірки, нудота, темний глухий підвал. На добраніч, класики, поговоримо завтра.
Здерта шкура Гомбровича безгучно падає вниз.
Є кілька речей, про які треба сказати.
Але невідомо, як про це сказати.
Бо невідомо, як про це говорити.
Про речі найважливіші та вирішальні.
Якщо є такі речі.
А такі речі усе ще є.
Невідомо як, але треба сказати. І я спробую сказати. Не вперше, а радше вчергове, враховуючи кожен мій вкурвлений внутрішній монолог. Не знаю як, але мушу сказати.
Наприклад, те, що культура важлива.
Культура важлива.
І не тільки для мене, а може тільки для мене, і я сильно помиляюся. Але якщо придивитися, то я не так уже сильно й помиляюся. Тому все-таки я хочу сказати, що культура потрібна.
І сказати це раз і назавжди. Культура потрібна.
І не нам вона потрібна.
Бо ми її вже трохи мали.
І ще трохи маємо.
Це гарантує нам Конституція, у якій усім громадянам гарантується свобода літературної, художньої, наукової і технічної творчості, захист інтелектуальної власності їхніх авторських прав, моральних і матеріальних інтересів, що виникають у зв'язку з різними видами інтелектуальної діяльності у моїй улюбленій 54 статті.
Стаття 54. Громадянам гарантується свобода літературної, художньої, наукової і технічної творчості, захист інтелектуальної власності, їхніх авторських прав, моральних і матеріальних інтересів, що виникають у зв'язку з різними видами інтелектуальної діяльності. Кожний громадянин має право на результати своєї інтелектуальної, творчої діяльності. Ніхто не може використовувати або поширювати їх без його згоди за винятками, встановленими законом. Держава сприяє розвиткові науки, встановленню наукових зв'язків України зі світовим співтовариством. Культурна спадщина охороняється законом. Держава забезпечує збереження історичних пам'яток та інших об'єктів, що становлять культурну цінність, вживає заходів для повернення в Україну культурних цінностей народу, які знаходяться за її межами.
Не знаю як, але я мушу сказати. Я дуже хочу це пояснити, що суспільство, яке ми постійно будуємо,
Бо все-таки постійно будуємо.
воно ж буде для наших дітей,
А діти – це добрий приклад.
що діє безпосередньо на серце та уяву.
Отже, уявімо собі дітей. Усю велику популяцію, яка прагне всього, до чого може дотягнутися її ручка, її личко, її мозкові звивини, що саме формуються і ще не сформовані. Що буде?
А так буде, якщо навколо цієї спраглої до всієї популяції не буде нічого.
Ні, але завжди щось буде.
Те, що виживе, те й буде. А виживе, як відомо, найсильніший.
І, як відомо, це буде не театр, не галерея і не філармонія.
Невідомо як, але треба сказати, що таким суспільством легко керувати і його легко обслуговувати.
Це правда.
Я так не хочу.
Я протестую проти цього.
Я не хочу жити в такому суспільстві.
Це мій протест. Справжній, серйозний і сумний. Може, ще хтось, як і я, не хоче?
Кілька людей так точно.
Кілька людей знає це відчуття протесту. Справжнього, серйозного і сумного.
Невідомо як. Невідомо як, я насправді не знаю, як про це сказати. Але я хотів би це сказати. так, щоб мене почули.
Це не протест із якоїсь однієї причини
З приводу одного рішення.
проти однієї людини.
Щоб це було зрозуміло.
Хоча очевидно, що трохи так, що теж є зрозуміло.
Але зрештою це не протест із якоїсь однієї причини.
З приводу одного рішення чи проти однієї людини.
Передовсім я би хотів сказати про більшу кількість людей, які протестують разом зі мною. І про більшу кількість людей, які є причиною цього протесту.
Я хочу сказати про занепад та кризу.
Про війну та відбудову.
Я хочу сказати про школи, лікарні, театри.
Які є гарантією існування демократії.
Які є гарантією вільного і контролюючого владу суспільства.
Бо школи, лікарні, театри є частиною цього суспільства.
Школи, лікарні, театри для цього суспільства. Тобто для нас усіх.
100 баксів, чувак. Я хочу сказати, що фінансування театру є також доплатою за квитки.
Прошу мене почути.
Фінансування театру – це не доплата до наших дуже дорогих відпусток.
Це доплата до дешевих квитків, щоб вони надалі були дешеві і доступні для багатьох.
А не для обраних, які легко можуть витратити 1000 гривень за квиток на особу.
Я не знаю, скільки таких осіб є, які легко можуть витратити 1000 гривень.
Знаю пару таких, які не можуть витратити. Я і сам не можу.
Бо, зрештою, це бар'єр, який не може подолати частина суспільства, яка теж платить податки.
А театр існує на гроші платників податків, тобто і на гроші тих, які, власне, не мають вільної 1000 гривень.
Я дуже хочу пояснити, проти чого я протестую.
Це стосується не тільки нас тут із вами, але також нашої держави, яка будує стадіони, але не будує театри.
Ні. Я не маю нічого проти стадіонів, навіть якщо вони завеликі і потребують завеликих коштів на утримання.
Ні, я не маю нічого проти. Принагідно до стадіонів десь з'явився шматок дороги, десь шматок тротуару, і чудово, і це на краще. Я насправді проти цього нічого не маю.
Тільки чому принагідно при нагоді будування стадіонів ми не будували театрів?
Брат, пиво кончилось. Часто мистецтво порівнюють із садом.
Часом називають святинею.
Я, власне, з цим не погоджуюся, але хай буде.
Порівняно з фізичною культурою, просто культура, яка не є фізичною. Зрозуміло, що немає жодних шансів.
Отже, мені йдеться про шанс.
Про рівноправ'я.
Про можливість вибору.
Чи хочу я йти на стадіон, чи в театр?
Чи хочу дивитися телевізор, чи театр. Зрештою, теж на літеру Т, але якось інакше.
Звичайно, ніхто нікого не примушує. Хай кожен вибирає те, що хоче вибрати, прошу дуже. Тільки хай цей вибір буде. Бо без можливості вибору опускаються руки.
Що це за світ?
Єдина полиця з продуктами з конвеєру.
Єдина колона однаково думаючих голів.
Я не знаю, як я маю це краще пояснити. Бо, може, хтось любить читати книжки?
Я, наприклад, люблю.
І ходити в театр я, наприклад, люблю.
І, може, той хтось, такий як я, має на це право, бо теж є громадянином.
В меншості, але однак з громадянством українським і сплаченими податками.
Курва радіо. Як це всім добре пояснити?
Як це пояснити образно?
Те, що в мене в голові і до чого мене змушує страх.
Страх, що хтось за мене прийме рішення про мене.
І треба буде до чогось себе прикувати.
Або постійно протестувати.
А я не хочу постійно протестувати.
Читати листи, писати листи, на які ніхто не відповідає і, мабуть, не читає.
Я хочу грати вистави, які хтось дивиться.
І навіть багато хтосів.
І знаю, я можу собі це організувати приватно, якщо маю таке бажання.
В приватному театрі, з друзями.
Де щось якось.
Але, однак, до цього часу ніхто не сказав мені голосно.
Ти не потрібний, нам не потрібен театр, бо нам вистачає того, що ми маємо. А ми маємо немало, ми маємо багато телевізійних каналів і розважальних розваг.
Це була б смілива заява і чітке повідомлення, однак його ніхто не виголосив.
А може, й виголосив. Тільки я його ще не чув.
І роблю зараз щось зовсім непотрібне.
Але я все ж таки спробую.
І хочу висловитися на цю тему, бо маю право.
Бо все погано стає ще гіршим.
Чи ви бачили, наприклад, як виглядають гримерні в театрах?
Я запросив би вас до гримерних, але соромлюся.
Виглядають вони саме так, як виглядають.
Грибок, пліснява, все прогнило.
Я не буду вас епатувати подробицями, я не борюся за купу грошей, теплу посаду і легку роботу, яка так насправді не є роботою, а тільки кривлянням якимось.
А так, це насправді це і є робота.
Культура є роботою. Я борюся за свою роботу так, як борються шахтарі.
Тільки ми не вийдемо на вулицю.
А може й вийдемо,
Обурені інтелігенти.
вже не соромлячись свого обурення.
Тільки я ще не знаю, як довести, що я не верблюд.
Не невіглас.
Не занурений у себе митець із мухами в голові.
Я ще не знаю, як це довести, але знаю, що мушу, бо ніхто інший цього не зробить.
А може й зробить.
Лемберська катастрофа.
Хочу ще дещо сказати. Про вплив культури на розвиток економіки. Бо є такий вплив культури, як важливої складової економічного розвитку. Про вплив культури на інновації в суспільстві, бо є такий вплив. Про вплив культури на надходження до бюджету держави, бо є такі надходження.
Цілком реальні надходження. Бо кожна гривня, витрачена з бюджету на культуру, приносить у той самий бюджет 3 гривні.
Увага! Ще раз. Вкладаєш у культуру гривню, отримуєш для бюджету 3 гривні. Вкладаєш гривню, отримуєш 3.
Увага ще раз. Отримуєш 3 гривні, якщо вкладеш гривню.
Щоб було зрозуміло.
Не знаю як, але мушу ще сказати, для чого є культура і чому за неї варто платити.
Бо я вважаю, що якщо ми утримуємо за гроші платників податків Збройні сили, ми також повинні за ці гроші утримувати театри.
Чому? А з цієї самої причини. Для захисту наших кордонів,
Для захисту кордонів суверенності і демократії.
Може, хтось знає, як це сказати? Як це пояснити, щоб було зрозуміло? Чи можна Збройні сили порівняти з театром?
а власне, можна.
Але тільки немає в наших дискусіях цієї мови.
Бо наша мова зменшилася радикально до мови цифр.
Тепер говорять лише цифрами.
Тільки цифри викликають повагу.
Особливо, якщо за ними стоять гроші.
Прошу звернути увагу на те, що цифри – це тільки одна з можливих цінностей.
А є ще інші цінності, які теж мають свою вартість.
Тому що ніколи тебе не вирвеш, ніколи не забереш. Тому що вся твоя свобода складається із меж. Тому що в тебе немає жодного вантажу. Тому що ти ніколи не слухаєш, оскільки знаєш і так, що я скажу.
Очевидно, що є криза.
Очевидно, що треба економити.
Кризою можна багато виправдати.
Закрити багато ротів, що кричать.
Адже на лікарні нема.
На школи нема.
І на інші зворушливі такі, як лікарні і школи, слова.
Я розумію це, розумію.
Але дечого не розумію. Чому з державного бюджету завжди можна щось украсти?
Чому завжди можна витратити купу грошей на якусь дурість?
На феєрверки чи участь в Євробаченні.
Чи на ямковий ремонт доріг?
Криза.
Гроші?
На ямковий ремонт доріг.
Повторюю.
На ямковий ремонт доріг.
Саме так.
На ямковий ремонт доріг.
Гроші на ями.
Що значно менше зворушує, ніж слово лікарня чи слово школа.
Гроші. Не чиїсь, а наші.
Отже, давайте не будемо про кризу.
Не про кризу тут мова.
Може, про відповідальність?
Може, про уяву більшу, ніж
Ямковий ремонт доріг.
Тому що в цій мові не лишилося жодних нормальних слів. Тому що синтаксис, який нас рятував, давно застарів. Тому що, повіривши одного разу, будеш вірити до кінця. Тому що мені саме тепер не вистачає твого імені та лиця.
Я не дам тобі жити так, як ти хотіла, мені назло. Ніби я не зупиняв для тебе кров, ніби нічого і не було. Я все одно спробую хоча б якось тобі допомогти. Я все одно все зіпсую, все одно досягну мети.
Сама подумай, як би я відмовився від твоїх листів. Ти ж розумієш, що я від тебе хотів. Я хотів, щоб все було так, як хотіла ти. Тому доведеться далі писати всі ці листи.
Доведеться змиритись з тим, що все мене.
Доведеться не говорити про важливе та головне.
Доведеться боятись свободи, триматися меж.
Щастя не оминеш.
Щастя не оминеш.
Щастя не оминеш.
Коли ти смієшся, тобто радієш, неначе кіт, примружуєш очі, нічого навколо не бачиш. Коли ти плачеш, тобто сумуєш, і сльози очі заливають, нічого навколо не бачиш. Коли не смієшся і не плачеш, а так собі на правій чи на лівій ніжці скачеш, сонце б'є в очі, рукою їх від сонця закрий, нічого навколо не бачиш, отже ти зрячий. Нічого навколо не бачиш. Отже ти зрячий, нічого навколо не бачиш. Отже ти зрячий, нічого навколо не бачиш. Нічого навколо не бачиш. Отже ти зрячий, нічого навколо не бачиш. Отже ти зрячий.
Ми щиро вдячні партнеру нашого конгресу театру Лесі, які так погоджуються на такі експерименти, відважно на них, на деконструкцію простору, на можливість буквально швидко реагувати на ідею. Дякую вам дуже всім, що ви швидко відгукнулися і взяли участь у цьому триб'юті. Дякуємо театру Лесі. А тим часом, поки ми тут готуємося, цілком логічним продовженням цього буде театральна дискусія про сюжети нашого буття. І я з задоволенням запрошую модераторку цієї дискусії, пані Оксану Данчук, яка є кураторкою конкурсу п'єс, якщо я не помиляюся, завідувачкою літературної частини театру Лесі. І, власне, вона зараз провадитиме нас через сюжети. Оксано.
second day on the Congress of Culture. It has the title of Coexistence, and in the second block we are going to talk about theater. And it seems to me that it is very relevant to talk about theater in the block of the coexistence, because in the theater this coexistence can be researched in the best possible way. And I'm very happy that today this discussion is held with the amount of members that we should have had, and I'm very happy to introduce our participants. Next to me is Dmitro Zakhozenko, main director of the theater and theatrical teacher. Veronika Sklarova, cultural manager and culture specialist, executive director of Parad Fest and producer of company Dolmet. Next to her is Oksana Cherkashina, actress of theater and cinema in Ukraine and Poland. And next to Oksana, Irina Chizhinova, theater scientist, curator of theatrical projects, teacher of Kyiv National Academy of Arts, and the head of analytical department of Ukrainian Cultural Foundation of 2019-2021. Next to Irina, Dmitro Levoitsky, producer, dramaturg, and creator of the City Theatre. My first question to participants of the discussion is the following. How do you see Ukraine through modern Ukrainian theater? From your point of view, of course, what plots are the most important there? What are dominant? What plots are ignored? And how real it is? How real Ukrainian life is different from Ukrainian life that is depicted by Ukrainian theater? Maybe somebody wants to be the first? Hello everybody. Since I'm the first one, then my task is to join yesterday's and today. And Oksana has mentioned that today we are going to talk about the theater. Actually, yesterday we also talked about the theater, because everything that is happening in the society happens in the theater as well. Theater is such an interesting model that integrates or reflects absolutely everything that is happening in society, integrates in different ways, actually. Yesterday we talked about catastrophes. Whether Ukrainian theater is working with catastrophe topic? Yes, it does. Post-apocalyptic topics is present in 5 or 6 places in different cities, so it's present there. It is not connected with pandemic or epidemic. It's man-made apocalypses, but still theater is working on the topic of catastrophes and return us to those categories that were mentioned yesterday. That if we have a catastrophe, then we have catharsis, and it is also one of the tools of not implementation, but at least of attempts to think about why do we need a theater nowadays? What does it do with those plots? How does it work with the audience? And in which ways? It seems to me also that in Ukrainian theater we have topic of war, and very close to it is the topic that was inspired by war that we started talking about, and the topic of abuse. And it's also, as of me, very noticeable shift in this agenda formed by Ukrainian theater. But on the other side, when I was preparing for this discussion, and Oksana was telling what we were going to talk about, so when we talk about Ukrainian theater, if one tries to imagine the system of Ukrainian theaters and say that we have around 140,000 state theaters in Ukraine, unknown amount of independent theaters, around 300, so we have more of them, and 140 of state and 300 of independent. So if we have, let's say, have 20 plays in average in the theaters and around 5-7 plays in independent theaters, then we have 6,000-7,000 plots that are depicted in every particular theater, every particular city. So if we talk about retrospective point of how we can understand all of this, then there is no such point. So I talked and I will talk about this avant-garde that wants to introduce something new to Ukrainian theater. It does not work with what we already have, but tries to voice and suggest something new. That's why if to talk about plots of our reality and Ukrainian theater, we have those plots, they are present there, but how they are worked with and what are the consequences, we will discuss a little bit later. Thank you. I wanted to say about reading that we have just heard. It was reading of text that usually we have all heard, or maybe we didn't hear from Miss Barbara. And the last time when I heard this monologue, it was near Kharkiv Regional State Administration, when state theaters were trying to get higher salaries, and it's mostly independent theaters, because state theaters did not know how to conduct protests, how to hold protests. And Misko Barbara went there with them, and he was reading very enthusiastically this text. And this text was so relevant. It was about right for culture, about financing of theaters, about schools, crisis, hospitals. You can imagine that the employees of state theaters had their salaries cut, and of course it was his place of protest. And at that moment you felt very strongly that in Ukraine the place of the theater is to talk. And I am very grateful to Ivana that we commemorated Misko not with silence but with talking. It's very important to translate those senses, but it's also important to talk about places of theater. But this protest was not heard in Kharkiv. It was a populism. For 3 months they got their salaries back. Now they take it away again, and they lay off employees. So to talk about senses and to be not heard, that's the place of the theater. Thank you. Oksana, maybe you, because I see that you have microphone in your hands. I can help a little bit here. What Veronika has mentioned, I do not want to paint it in dark or light colors and say that it's a sad news, that's the place of the theater. But in reality, even I talk about such topics and about the place of Ukrainian theater in the life of society, and whether society can become the semi-publical space that Pascal Guillain was talking about, so the space where community is formed, which later goes to public space and changes public spaces in accordance to those senses that were formed in those semi-public spaces. And in reality, it's also very difficult, serious topic for discussion, because theater today is not heard, is not seen in its to the full extent, and the place of the theater in Ukraine, unfortunately, is one of the last. I always mention, in a nutshell, I always say that theater is not included in this must-see or must visit of Ukrainian intellectual person. First of all, if the theater works with prepared audience, let's say it's at least minimally, then for us the first night or the book or exhibition always always bigger events than, let's say, first night in the theater. So this moment, or where the theater is ready today, is capable to talk with different audiences, which audience it is targeted on. For me, it's never-ending topic. Concerning discourse and what the theater is doing, of course, the uh, the tone, or the majority of people work like this, it's a neutral tone. If to talk about discourse of authorities, what is extremely interesting for me is always neutral. Theater has never provoked. Theater never creates acute, sharp moments. There are, of course, certain amount of plays that do work with different difficult topics and go to the move to this territory of provocation and try to do something with this. But theater is a very specific ways of art with those limited territories and audiences, and whether those audiences share these ideas, whether they become that society that also cannot be lost in public space and stay as a society, that's still a question for me. Thank you. Irena, as far as I understand, you meant that the theater is very quiet, it's too quiet or too limited. I would say reserved. And I wanted to ask Dmytro Levitsky and Dmytro Zakhozhenko whether they agree with that. Good morning, everybody. And first of all, thank you for the invitation. It's really great to be here in Lviv. And it's cool that we all have found time to talk about culture. I would also add to your question about theater. I think that theater, first of all, has to be space for people to meet. We can call it public space, semi-public space, but for Ukrainian society, it seems to me it is extremely important to meet for different layers of society, different groups of people. And historically, it is like this. Theater is the place where the whole city can meet. Rich people, poor people, the homeless, the drug addicts, and we have lots of topics to discuss and lots of situations, lots of issues that need to be discussed, need to be talked through, need for us to meet. And I am not even talking about the stage here. It's very important. It's not only the stage, where it's also about public, the audience that goes into the hall. And I think that those 140 state theaters and this unknown amount of independent theaters, that they do this function, but maybe it needs to be done a little bit better, performed a little bit better. So, if to talk in a more detailed way, I think that I want theaters to talk more in their local history, and Kyiv theater should talk about Kyiv, Lviv theater should talk about Lviv, even though it does not, they could still talk about wider topics, of course. I forgot your question about Ira. I asked clarifying question whether you agree with the fact that Ukrainian theater is too reserved, too quiet, so quiet that it is not even heard, neither in Ukraine in some authorities' offices nor on the streets. I think that Ukrainian theater is pretty variable, different. It's difficult to say in average whether Ukrainian theater is talking too quiet or too loud. We need to understand that we do have huge history of the Soviet Union, which left its heritage, and it's connected with everything, with the principle of how the theaters are financed, with how they work. It seems to me that there has no been reform or changes that could have given us more specifically, yes, how the theater works. So it's difficult to say. Thank you. Dmytro Захоженко. Good morning. Yes, I actually agree that theater talks quietly and weakly and it's not heard. I actually have conducted research and for this event, and because I also perceive theater from some kind of my own from my own bubble, and we can talk here about some protests, some no, informal stuff, but I have opened lots of repertoire of Kyiv theaters, some local theaters, and I looked what plays they have, and it's surprising that 95% are comedies. It's at least what I have seen. It's not something that we have. But I have seen mostly different comedy, erotic comedy, some horror from black comedy. So everybody finds something interesting in genres, and you always feel something ugly. Feel ugly towards such events in the theater. But I also see that it still work with this trauma, and it is actually how they depict this medieval culture, when people has to work somehow with the trauma that they have in the society, and they do this the way they can through some funny comedies, funny plays where they can at least breathe this air. And at this moment, this estrangement from this type of theater disappeared, and I found some gentleness towards it. I wanted to hug it, and I wanted to say, just, let's move together. And I thought, as Ira has mentioned, that theater is not hurt. Yes, it's not hurt, but the dialogue that is happening right now in the wider meaning of Ukrainian theater through comedy, through some erotic comedy, then maybe it is a variant to work through genre, because it's a great idea that the theater is the place where all citizens should gather, but they do not do this. Of course, there are cities where theater of culture is developed more, sometimes less, but usually people come more to see comedies. Maybe it's one of the variants is to work through genre, or just to go beyond theater. And maybe the place of modern theater in some factories or in office centers where this dialogue can be found. Good morning, everybody. I'm also very grateful for the invitation, and I'm happy to be here in Lviv, eventually at home in Ukraine. And I would like to add to what Ira has said, that theater is too quiet and that we do not have those protests or interventions. And maybe I just imagine this future of Ukrainian theater. I think a lot about this, not about future, not about what's happening right now, and what critic narrations we can suggest at this moment. And for me right now, because I live in Poland, it's a very bright example. Critical political theater in Poland for the last 20 years has made some amazing things. They have had everything. Prosecutor's office, because theater was super loud. 5 years ago, I was always surprised how the theater is rooted into the society, how society reacts, how media reacts, and this theater, using the terminology of era, is very loud, very protesting, very bright. I don't know what else I can say. It really existed, but now they are in some kind of crisis because they understand that they have had everything already and reality is still the same. So this critical narrative was very strong, but reality still hasn't changed. If to look at conditions, political conditions in Poland and what's happening there right now, then it seems to me the situation in the country and in the society is becoming worse and worse. And this political theater, as it seems to us, they were fighting for a better future for person, and this reality becomes worse and worse. So that's why when I think about future of Ukrainian theater, I think that protests or some bright interventions, that's not a way out, because any pro-government dispute, it's still protest we'll have this protest note in it, but then later it will stop working for change. And that's why it seems to me that the way out here solution is not protest, not some loud voice of Ukrainian theater, but I imagine it as in change of policy, everyday work which changes what we imagine about theater for us. So I do not see it as some bright single interventions, even in political space, that seemed very interesting for me some time ago. But now I assume that we need to methodologically do everything day by day, so the things we do disagree with just stop existing. Thank you. I would like to add, thank you, Oksana, who summed up everything that Dmytro were talking about. And what Dmytro has mentioned about comedies, it's absolute truth. I also have looked at repertoires of the theaters, and I was amazed to tell you the truth, because we are talking about virus of COVID-19, and we have virus of Hanuma and Lady Chatterley. That's two most famous comedies. Of course, we have also some Ukrainian comedies, but it's difficult for me to understand, and maybe they want to overcome some complexes through those texts. But about Ukrainian theater, it's difficult, always difficult to talk about Ukrainian theater, because personally for me, and when you start thinking about that, it is not written anywhere. There are no markers or no answers to the questions how much time should pass in the moment when the system that was destroyed and was practically destroyed by 95% of its potential, when it should revive, when it should renew. Because what happened in Ukrainian theater in the 1930s, it's a unique history, a unique story. Everybody knows that there were repressions, and they were in the Russian theater as well. But Russian theater, yes, it was repressed, but then later they constructed this iconostasis we all pray to nowadays, and Ukrainian theater was almost completely destroyed. So those people who formed some ideas, some trends, they were destroyed completely. And on the one hand, it's a trauma. On the other hand, it's this not lived through catastrophe, so it's understood. And as for me, the theater that later in many years existed underground, for them, how they should get back the status of semi-public space, it's actually not such a big difference here. It's a question. how to get out of those catacombs and get this subjectivity that the theater had. So I do not have the answer to this question, how much time should pass, whether 30 years is enough for Ukrainian theater, which had 70 years of very difficult times. I would like to go back a little bit to depicting of the society in the theater and contemplate a little bit about the topic mentioned by Thomas Irman. It's a theater specialist from Germany, pretty famous one, and he mentioned that theater and artistic life in Ukraine is much more interesting right now than in Germany because it is developing, because it is looking for its own identity, it's looking for its own place in the society, and it has much more energy than, for example, in European theaters. And what Ksusha has just mentioned, that Poland has ecosystem, they have media, they talk about those first nights, and they are allowed people come there, citizens come there. In Ukraine, we do not have such event. Theater is just kind of some black gap, it does not exist at all like message in Ukraine. So here I would like to think about two aspects. Maybe we will be able, I would like to believe in this as an optimist, maybe we will be able to find that place in Ukraine for the theater in the society, and it can be, and it will be, we'll be able to influence something. And on the other side, we do not have ecosystem of theater nowadays at all. It's cut, it's not finished, we do not have criticism, we do not have media. We do have media, but they do not depict what is going on right now. Theaters do not have feedback, specialist feedback, skilled feedback, and very often they exist in some kind of lagoon bubble. And I would like to express my gratitude to this space, to Les Ukrainka Theater, because it's an example for me, because they form messages. You can notice that every season the theater starts to verbalize some kind of narrative and depict it in their projects. And it is a unique situation in Ukraine. It's actually a city in which the theater occupies the place it should occupy, formation of messages. So it seems to me that, for example, play 146 Stars, I haven't seen it yet, but I think for Lviv or for Kharkiv it's an event. It's very, I cannot say that it's super safe play, and I think that theater tried to find its place, but it's so local. It's like unique situation, and it is depicted by Ukrainian society. We balanced between revolution and the war. We cannot find a place for our values here. I, for example, cannot do this.
I would like to add that, in my opinion, theater and theater facilities, theater spaces are not just places where you get the message or where you get the political agenda, where you hear from the stage or where you affect people from the stage, where you affect political events in the country. In my opinion, theater, first of all, is the practice of training your attention and imagination. People, local residents, come to the theater to imagine something, or vice versa, to keep their attention. And I think that urban theaters in Ukraine, let's say children's theaters or theaters that are working with the local context, as for me, they are doing quite well. The audience come to these theaters. I wouldn't be that critical and claim that just some theaters do their best. I would look at it through a different lens. Yes, we do lack theaters that are quite harsh in their messages. Yes, we do lack authors who can afford to go against the mainstream or the main principal direction common throughout the country. Yes, we do lack this, but I think that we have this other type of theater which is doing quite well, especially if we look at different district and regional theaters. I've just come back from Khmelnytsky, and the people who attend the Staritsky Khmelnytsky theater, they're quite satisfied. Thank you, Dmitro. I have to tell our gratitude to all the speakers and our panelists. I'm reminding the audience that you have a chance to ask questions to our panelists. If you have a question, just let our volunteers know and they will give you the mic. I see that we already have 2 questions. Thank you. Keep them in mind. I still have one more question that I'd like to ask in continuation of the topic we have just touched upon, and then we will come back later to your questions and you'll have an opportunity to ask them. Thank you for being active. So the next question is the following. We've discussed meetings and dialects in the theater and their importance, and that the dialogue in the theater is disrupted for a number of different reasons. And I'd like to ask you about the audience and also about the interaction with the audience. I came up with this question listening to Oksana's answer and reflections during the discussion which happened last week, the discussion Theater and Reality, where Dmitro also participated, and that was a discussion summarizing the Black Box program happening at Jam Factory. And there, Oksana, you told this story that for you it was important and emancipatory when you realized it wasn't the audience looking at you, but you looking at the audience from the stage. I remembered this idea of yours and I kept it in mind for several days. So I have a question for you, first of all, and then our other panelists can answer the same question. So who do you see when you look at the audience, when you look at the people who go to the theater? Who are these people? Are they different in different cities and in different countries? That's the case for you, Oksana. And how would you outline an ideal relationship with the audience? Thank you for the question. I have to tell you that I will be speaking from the perspective of an actress. When I was interviewed, I was speaking from the perspective of an actress. I think I came up with this idea because we've been discussing with my colleagues from the theater for quite a long time. You know them, Rosa Sarkisyan and others. So we were discussing the subjectivity, actors being subjects, and emancipation of actors. I think it's a process when you are not entrusted with power by someone and people start treating you differently, but it's a process when you start realizing that you can create these mechanisms by yourself, the mechanisms of becoming a subject. So when I realized that when I came on stage as an object, I felt some shame. That's part of the profession, and up until the moment when I realized that I came on the stage to see the people. And with time, I also understood that through this psychological situation, I can transform my opinions. I'm not working for the people, but I'm working with the people. And when I come on stage as an actress, as an individual, I always see people who are equals, who are my equals. I've heard many discussions, and I've been asked whether I understand who my audience is, and I think that in political sense theaters need to know who their audience is. It's a dialect, something that I called politics, and we need to have this dialect. But when I'm on stage performing my part, I just see people who are my equals, and I have no other tools rather than communicating with them and just imagining that they are the same people as I am. There is no other mechanism that I know of. And the third question about the audience, whether people are different in different towns and countries. Yes, they are different. I remember that my opinion as an actress has been quite stereotypical, but the audience always surprises me. I always think that I know enough about people, but that's quite a stereotype, and the audience surprises me. They manage to surprise me. The audiences vary. I will be giving you very specific examples. Nowadays in Poland, you may have heard about this, since 2016 they've been having protests against abortions. The ban on abortions that the Polish government wants to implement on the national level. So this is quite a sisterhood of Polish women, and I'm performing in Polish plays, and I realized that it's a completely different community of women. They are so open in their responses, and it's just hard to convey and verbalize what I'm feeling. My experience is quite limited. I'm speaking about Warsaw here, even though I'm performing in plays throughout Poland, but what I'm seeing is that this situation has changed the political interaction of women in the public space. Why women? Because I'm an actress, and I very often, when performing on stage, realize what kind of manipulation I'm employing when playing my part. So that's something that comes to mind, but generally we are guided by our stereotypes about the audience, because we never know who is sitting in the audience at this very moment. Dmytro Zahorzhenko, main director of Lesa's Theater, where we currently are. So the question for you, who do you see in your audience, and do you feel that you have a dialogue with these people, and how would you see your ideal relationship with the audience? I'll give some more reflections on the previous ideas discussed. Obviously, audience varies, and theaters create their own audiences, and they exist in this limited circle. And what Dmytro mentioned, that children's theaters managed to do well, managed to establish this dialogue with the audience. I think that for many theaters the dialogue ends at a specific stage when they have already found their audience. And when we speak about local children's theaters, they are distributing tickets via schools and kindergartens, and that's how they attract their audience. I don't think very many children come up to their parents and suggest that they go to the theater together to watch a performance about Pinocchio. So I don't think this dialogue is that successful. And if I speak from my own experience or the experience of our theater, in my dreams, I see that we are building this dialogue, but one of the recent performances of Stop Girls happening within the Golden Lion Festival, we had a completely different audience coming to the performance, and I noticed that the dialogue was different because the audience was different, and it was quite strange because I saw that the audience did not really understand what they were seeing on the stage. And when we had the premiere of 146 Stars, and this performance is about LGBT community, and we invited our audience for the opening night, and the the next showings were already attended by people who bought tickets, and that was a completely different audience. I was afraid, but at the same time interested in the opportunity of showing this performance somewhere at a factory, at a completely different setting, because dialogue, I think that theaters are not building the dialects effectively. I think in Khmelnytsky, Kherson, Lviv, Kyiv, the theaters have their own audiences. It's again your familiar bubble, and at a certain moment of time you cannot leave that bubble, and any critical performance, even the most genius one, will have less of an effect than let's say a protest shown during prime time on one of our popular TV channels. I think that the objective of contemporary theater is to establish a dialogue with a broader audience, because we are enclosed in the bubble of our audience. Yes, we have some interest around our performance, 146 stars, but because of the COVID limitations, we have only 50 people in the audience, so this is not a dialogue, this is not 1,000 people, not several thousand or a million. So I believe that theaters should be working in this direction, establishing new channels of communication, searching for new audiences, and children's theaters need to bring their Pinocchio performances to festivals to try and expand their audience and maybe change their performances in establishing a new type of dialogue. Yara, would you like to add? I would like to speak from the audience, because I'm a member of the audience, even though a professional one. What Matro was speaking about in reality does expand the visibility and probably the influence, but it makes theater a hostage, because Greek theaters could house up to 40,000 people in one hall, and the Soviet government had an idea about mass theater performances, and it was the key narrative of the Soviet government. But in fact, today theaters are also hostages to those big theater halls. When we speak about identity, which is the key term and which was already mentioned, we speak about identities in plural. So speaking about large communities today and communicating with the hall for 1,000 people and seeing this as a single community with one identity, I think that's a hard objective to achieve. So we are using the narrative that we are all Ukrainians, and that's something that unites us. But if we go below and we try to appeal to the public, not just through the national feature or gender, but we appeal to their civil stance or their opinion about some hot topics, that's where we are facing the challenges as to how we should be building the narratives, because we don't have just one community sitting in the audience, but a multiplicity of communities. Media is something that can be helpful. Dmytro Levitsky also mentioned one important term, attention. It happened so that for the past 2 years I've been working full-time at the office, and I started falling asleep during performances, and I realized that it's a complicated energy process, and energy and training attention and training your attention is complicated. It's hard to watch a performance when you're tired and your attention is limited, and you are trying to train your attention muscle. So basically this is similar to love, when we are shifting our attention focus and it's leaving the limits of our ego. So media and theater on the stage without actual presence, without the trigger of attention, it doesn't train this attention muscle. And in fact, it is important. I always say that theaters work with small communities, but these small communities have an opportunity to continue working outside of the theater and have the opportunity to create this ability. It's not about the quantity, it's about the quality. As I agree that, first of all, we need to rethink all this mania of big numbers and trying to encompass as many people as possible. Most of my current projects have to do with audio walks, that is answering your question about who do you see as your audience. So I'm working with very small groups of people, 15 to 20. That's enough for me. Another question is what Metro mentioned. So we have two Metro, so maybe one of us can be Dima and the other is Metro. So Metro was mentioning something about bubbles, and I think it's good that theaters have their own bubbles and their own audience. There's nothing bad about that. Another issue is that I have a suspicion, I'm speaking from my own experience, that we don't need genius performances. We need for the people to keep their attention, for the people to stay focused. And that is something that Ira mentioned. People come to the theater to switch off their devices for an hour and a half, because they cannot do that at home or back at their offices. So that is something that we need to achieve. We need to practice attention focusing of children, of teenagers, and the same goes about attention, which I already mentioned. Answering the question about the audience, I can add about people that I don't see as part of my audience. I don't see elderly people in my audience. I see very few people with health issues, and I think that we need to work on our inclusivity. That is something I believe. And again, accessibility of theaters, something that was discussed during our weekly meeting last week. In fact, not all people have access to theater. It's not about money, but it's about time. I don't have time to go to the theater. Our life, our routine life is so packed with work, packed with different events, and we are constantly shifting our attention so that we don't have time to go to the theater. So maybe state institutions, or the state in this case, so it might be interesting for them, and institutions and the state, which could be defined as policy, they need to work on these levels. They need to help urban residents on this micro level, help them find time for theater, or offer them ways on how to get to the theater. That's what I think. Thank you. So we can present theater as a practice of collective mindfulness. That's the conclusion that I'm drawing from your answer, something that requires our time here and now. Thank you to all of you for the reflections. I think we can come back to our audience. I see that we have some questions. Good morning. Thank you very much. It's very nice to see such cool people sitting up there. I have several comments. I think we can discuss them more informally after the discussion, but I have a question. Ira mentioned a number of plots and also that the number of dramatic situations is limited. So it's not about the plot, but it's about the ways that you stage the idea, how you are trying to convey the message to your audience. Also something that Dima once mentioned in his lecture, that theater happens among the audience, amidst the audience and the people who are watching the performance. And the other question, something I've been thinking about for quite a long time, the place of social. So does a person coming to the theater identify themselves with what is happening on the stage? So I will cite one director saying that in the ancient times the search of the image were in the center and social issues were on periphery. And now it appears that the social issues of the periphery have been shifted into the center. So I have the second question for you. What's the place of the social component in theater, and what should be the balance between the aesthetics and the social component? Thank you. Would anyone like to answer this question first, or is this question addressed to a specific speaker? So I have two questions here about the place of the social component, and the second question is about the quality of the messages delivered by the theater. I had three questions initially, but I thought it was already too much. So I will quickly answer your first question. We have a very limited access to professional quality education, so we have a limited circle of quality theater products. And I think that in Ukraine it's very hard to speak about quality and conveying messages, and also about the tools for achieving that, because we lack education and contemporary context. To answer your second question about the place of social component in theater, I would like to shift the perspective a little bit, because Oksana changed the lens by shifting between the object and subject, and it appears to me that I, as a producer and director of a festival, find it hard to talk about theater audience, because the theater is not a theater festival. It can be about architecture, urbanism, and this year one of the performances of the French theater was staged at Kharkiv City Hall, and the other one was supposed to take place at the facilities of former KGB, where they were to shoot some Polish officers, but we were not allowed to do that. So I think we shouldn't be speaking about the place of social in theater, but we should be speaking about the right of theater to stage its performances everywhere, because we can shift the performance by changing the location and using different perspectives and different situations. Apparently this is not an answer to your question, but this is to answer the question why I'm doing what I do. I want to expand the circle. Maybe 15 people are not enough, but I don't need to have 100 people. It's enough to have 80 at the Kharkiv City Hall. So the news that people got access to Kharkiv City Hall is already something that attracts attention, and that we can change the theater with our actions.
Concerning plots, that's the name of the panel, the title of the panel, and we need to say that this new topic appears in Ukrainian theater. That's actually how it is happening, with the attempt to change artistic language of the play, and once again to work with various images, at the same time understanding that verbal text is still less than the one on the stage, that the words of the play. But it's understandable that Ukrainian audience reacts better to the text of the play because we have very powerful oral tradition. We are a nation of word, and that's okay. Sometimes it's difficult for theater to have difficult visual images for them to be read properly by the audience. It is also a difficulty in it. Of course, it's understandable that language changes step by step, maybe not so radically, not so fast, but I will repeat once again. Yesterday we mentioned that culture is slow. It's good that we started with it because theater, for all the time that it has been existing, theater always has had this trauma, and that theater is very slow. Theater, the art about here and now, but usually it lags behind life. It was like this 200 years ago, and now it's not just lagging behind. It's difficult even to talk about this. But about proportions of artistic and social, why? I don't understand why we need to compare those two categories, to tell you the truth. Why social cannot be artistic and artistic cannot be social? Because then we have very difficult theoretic argument about definitions. I do not see any kind of problem in creating artistic images on social topics if in this quotation it is done in a way that we have social narrative, and we definitely need to have play which will be big artistically. Then we of course have to say that what does it mean if we say full-fledged artistic text? Should it be the synthesis of arts? We need to dance, we need to sing and be in beautiful costumes, and we need to have scenography for the whole stage. So this approach to artistic should also be discussed, and then we will understand that one can talk about social even in those plays which are closed with all those theatrical masks, because it was till we have a person on the stage, the theater is going to stay social. The way this person talks, the way this person looks, and something that is in his or her eyes, that's already social. Even when you look at our actors, you understand that they are the same people as we are. They are a little bit humped, and because we all they can be a little bit more excited because future is not known, and it cannot be taken away. The Ukrainian theater and Ukrainian society is basically more or less the same. It's very cool that you have mentioned that about to Ira now, that Ukraine, the theater is lagging behind a little bit with those, if to talk about those changes that we have right now. But I remember here that really great independent producer Sashko Protях. He recently has had an interview in Kharkiv publication Look. It seems to me that it's a very cool one, and he was talking about fast culture, that we live in the situation of fast culture, and to rethink, we rethink all of the things that are happening, some factories, or we rethink industrial areas. It is happening all the time. You just do one project, then the next one, and then it disappears. And there is no stability, no continuity. At the same time, theater is really very slow place. With its slowness, we also have to cooperate somehow. When we enter the theater, we kind of feel that we are in a very slow reality. And I would evaluate this as very important quality, very important peculiarity. with which theatrical producers can work and audience can work as well. We really come to the theater to stop a little bit. And those comments about 2020 about the year 2020, about the fact that everything stopped during pandemic, how you started rethinking everything. So it was also a theatrical experience in some sense for lots of people. So I would like for us to work with this too. I would like to add to your question, Bogdan, about this comparison of aesthetics and it was written like in social and ethics. I just wanted to say from my actor point of view. At some point, I understood that when you're actor, when you are acting, it just looks like it's a profession, and the task that we do like actors, that's aesthetic tasks. I understood that it's ethic tasks, not aesthetic, because to become different person, to become other, it's an ethic process to understand how to be another person, and at the same time have some different social dialogue meeting. I like it more. Then we need to have this ethical act. So of course I use some ethical grounds, and I do not want to start this long dialogue now, because aesthetics has already stopped being in the category of pleasant and beautiful. Aesthetics is actually a tool for us, for agents of the world, of society, to reform this society. This is actually aesthetics, so it's very close to me what Veronika has mentioned about the topic. I would like to add to Dima's remark a little bit. Vahtan Kipiani yesterday was talking about this, and he wrote about slowness of culture. And yesterday we also talked about digital detox, that also theater can be such a place. And I was thinking that yes, we are talking about the era of ultra speeds, but our heart will still have the same heart rate. It can be faster for somebody, of course, but then we move to some abnormal conditions. And this slowing, or this coming to the fact that person in any case is very difficult system that at some point has to enter some resonance and understand himself or herself from as that complex system and move to her own level. So theater, as Olha Ostrovar says, is the only way of art with the temperature, with the same temperature as person has, human temperature. And it's a very important method when you enter the system and you are equals among equals. When you have your pulse rate. A question we want to react, and then you will have the possibility to ask next question. Yes, I just want to say something because everybody has said something, and I would like to say something as well. Um, Bogdan, about this difficult difference between ethics and aesthetics, and that's a reflection that Bogdan has had in the play 146 Stars, because it seems to me that we have lots of aesthetics in that play. There are lots of beautiful pictures there, but I look at it more like a practitioner, and for me, uh, everything that works in theater works. And if 20, 30 years ago you were working on some eternal topics, that's it's pretty easy to neglect them right now. Then I would use them. But theater right now is always about searching for dialogue, searching for contact, searching of common language and this the common point, and finding it. And if there is a possibility to do that, then it has to be used, because without it there will be no dialogue. And that's all. theater is always about dialogue. It either can happen or not. And then we have very conditional things. So this play is very much about aesthetics for me. That the person has watched it and has said that no, it's not about aesthetics, it's about social component. Thank you, Bogdan. Thanks. My gratitude to all speakers. We have had one more question from the audience. We can hear it now. Grigory, PE teacher. I already told to the to the person from the Dutch. If we do not have theatrical studies in school, then no culture can be revived. In the schools should have theatrical uh, place there, but you unfortunately do not understand this. The second question. The representative who works in Poland has mentioned that in Poland they have had pretty cool theatrical plays, but it still does not influence Polish society. But on the other side, she said that there was a protest. You have to awake conscious of Ukrainian nation through philosophical theatrical plays. Where do we have the play how Hitler or Stalin raised to power? There is no such place. Where is the play when Yanukovych raised to power? We do not have such plays. There are no plays for society to understand how our state, to what extent our state is corrupted. I, if you have some philosophical topics in your theaters, ancient Greece. Why ancient Greeks were wise people? Because theater played the main role in their life. They were Greeks were citizens of Greece. Since I'm a PE teacher, where do we have thematics of Olympic Games? We do not have topics of Olympic Games. Where do they talk about coaches, about athletes? You have so much work. I'm very grateful for your work. We are very grateful for such a question. I think Dima and Metro, as producers, they, as directors, they of course noticed your ideas, and you will be able to have such plays. From good news, last year, Ministry of Education had a program approved. It's called Theater and Dramaturgs. It's now tested by 12 schools with in the framework of the program of New Ukrainian School. Let's hope that it will grow to manual, to book. Yes, I agree that we do need to have such activities in schools. That there should be theatrical extracurricular activities, but it seems to me that from our but it seems to me that it's a very traumatic experience for me. We really need to work a lot, and for all of us, as it has been mentioned. Obviously, theatrical education in Ukraine among average citizens, especially, is very low. As any actually as lots of other education in the sphere of art, classical music, and others. And there is a huge problem in it, which obviously cannot be solved very easily. I do not really believe in pedagogical function of the theater through uh, through that way that you suggest us. I do not think that we will be able to open the whole potential of Ukrainian nation in the play, and we will be able to convey it to the audience that will come to us. I don't know. It seems to me that the issue of absence of this culture is really enormous. It's enormous, and it's difficult to solve it, and it takes time. as Dima mentions about traumatic experience, for me, theater in the childhood, it's extremely traumatic experience. I have despised theater so much that I couldn't even imagine that in 16, 17 years I'm going to deal with it, because I only had experience at viewing at that point. Of course, now it changed, but I cannot say that it's the same. But in the 1990s, it's Kherson musical dramatical theater named after Mykola Kulish, and it was such a traumatic experience for me that I hated theater. To come to the theater and to treat theater as art, it was absolutely nonsense for me. Only later, after after I watched some great um, producers, great directors, I understood that it can be great experience, great trick. Theater shouldn't necessarily be like this. There are variants, there are ways how to do it in different way. And of course, it's obvious that all of us who are present here, I hope we are working in this field of spreading and introducing the theatrical culture. But of course, it's a difficult way, a slow one. I would like to express gratitude for your comment, and I would like to say that I absolutely agree that in Ukraine we have lots of white spots, topics which have not been discussed, historical traumas in our memory. But I was very much inspired by what Dima mentioned today, that it's a place of practicing imagination and attention, and maybe in some way we need to stop looking at in the past. I understand that it is extremely important topics that you have mentioned, some of those topics, and of course we will deal with them. But I also would like to change optics, as Veronica has mentioned, and look at the theater not in the past and as an attempt to work on those traumas, but to look at the theater as a place of practicing imagination and attention. It's very inspiring for me, especially based on the fact that majority of people in majority of my practice, I was actually dealing with this retrospective. So, Dima, thank you for this phrase today, and thank you for your comment. I also would like to express gratitude for all comments and questions from the audience, and I would probably ask my last question in this discussion to participants. Yesterday, it seems to me that it was a discussion about catastrophes as topos as modern culture. Valeria Korobleva has mentioned that catastrophe is not very relevant for Ukrainian culture. Ukrainians, by their mindset, are exhausted optimists. And I wanted to ask you whether you can say that you are like that you're exhausted optimist, and talk about and talk more specifically about the future of Ukrainian theater, about whether Ukrainian theater has bright future, and you have to be more specific, that what processes, what events, what people give you such hope for bright future. I personally really like this statement, because catastrophism is not very relevant for our national conscious. That's why Ukrainian theater missed such genre as tragedy and started from comedy. And this is true, and that's why Ukrainian culture has such strong protective functions, because culture saved nation, and it's our national culture is still stronger and does not let go. That it's just mechanisms of conservation, and it's understandable why. Existence of lack of state, it stimulates culture to those protective, very aggressive mechanisms of self-protection, self-preservation. And concerning catastrophisms, of course, we have a culture of Kurdocentrism and Vitaism and other ideas that fulfilled in the theater as well. But concerning optimism, yesterday we already had this phrase that we do not have that bright past where we can go back in our minds and say, yeah, we have had everything. We have to look in the future with this hope that we always are on our way to forming, to self-understanding. So, and that's why it is so difficult for us to feel happy here and now, to live through that moment, hoping for something, but also at the same time appreciating this reality more. Concerning our prospects in the theater, even weather forecasts are that's lie, you need to be very careful with them. So in Kyiv we are going to have a theater of dramaturgs open, so the society united, they had this space, and now you also actually can be co-authors of this theater through donates. And what we are looking, what is expecting us in the future, we will going to have this diffusion. Something disappears, something appears. Ukrainian theater is really very extremely different, and I like it because variety means life. It's one of the signs of life. When everything is the same, it's death. A life system is always going to be very active. So I think that some prospects, some artistic prospects, it's very difficult. It's difficult to forecast such an extremely complex system, which is a Ukrainian theater. When we hear this formulation bright future, there is a smile on our face. There is always some glimmer of a future for us. It's never bright. It's always waked. And Buddhist Groys, if I'm not mistaken, says that modern pace, it's not about past, it's not about future, it's today. And we look into it. And I agree with Ira that if we talk about some specific things, that Theater of Dramaturgs in Kyiv, that's a really great initiative, and I would advise to pay your attention to that theater, that new theater. I also would like to add that this summer I went to Enerhodar. Enerhodar is extremely great city. I really advise you to visit it. As they have they have power station there, and they have a small community that holds meetings for citizens, and it's exactly there where I met people, and it's exactly there where we have people who, so for me, care the most about Ukrainian culture. It turns out that in those small cities, we have local places, local meetings for people who are interested in culture in Kyiv or in culture in Lviv, and those views. So I have a dream to create more strange meetings, strange scenarios of activities, of actions in Ukraine and beyond it. It's interesting how Ukraine can contact with Latin America, for example, or with New Zealand. So that strange scenarios and scripts of behavior that's where they can appear. New senses can appear here, new views. I would pay my attention on that in my artistic thoughts. Thank you. It seems to me that my previous statement already was an answer for your question concerning future of Ukrainian theater. It seems to me, especially now after I hear your phrase, it's attention, imagination, it's in my head now all the time. We talked a lot about critical, social, political theater, which is still dealing with retrospectively dealing with problems that has happened. But it seems to me that if we think about future of Ukrainian theater, we need to start developing such skill as imagination, political imagination. It's extremely important to dream about such theater, to imagine it, and not just go in circles in that neurotic attempt to solve issues. I do not say that we shouldn't do this, but if we talk about future, then I think I think about this imagination. Veronica, Dmitro, do you want to add something? I also would like to talk about the theater of dramaturgs, and what I would like to talk about it, that they just did not open the doors as physical space. They started dialogue with their manifesto of values and targets, and their values and targets immediately made Stas Zharkov and some other activists some very very huge reaction. But it's, some kind of manifesto of an adolescence. So it's me, I am against. I start from this, and when we think about how I see future of Ukrainian theater, first of all, it has to change systematically. Those changes did not happen after law on competitions, unfortunately, and in majority of state theaters in Ukraine, those competitions are faked and nothing has changed. But something has to change because of COVID and because of other objective reasons. System of functioning of Ukrainian theater should be changed catastrophically. There should be a catastrophe here, I'm sorry. But for this to be changed, we really need to move this wetland somehow, and that's why we need actions. For us, the theater that happened in Kyiv. So it appeared, and immediately they say we are against it. It should be this, and like that. And it does not mean whether it's not important whether I agree with that manifesto or not. So, for example, I disagree with what Oksana has mentioned, that we move in circles and that it's not going to lead us to anything. But we didn't talk about Katyn, about Trachinbrit, about some very painful situations that I see as function of theater. So this moving in circles, maybe we need to reinvent language, maybe we need to talk about it from the different point of view. But theater has its function of talking and of taking out something that has happened, about reflections. This is the function. But I see future through catastrophe. And I think that catastrophe can be both. There shouldn't be one theater or one strategy or one line. We are going to move in our own ways. If to go back to our initial question about bright future of the theater, then I am an absolute optimist. I very optimistically treat future, and it seems to me that Ukrainian theater exists on that level. As Oksana and Dmitro has mentioned, that we can imagine, and we can imagine and we can want to do something different on you, and it doesn't matter which kind of theater we're talking about here. And now we have such possibility to at least imagine, and now we have this desire to create manifestos in 100 years after previous phase of manifestos. Now we have them again, and it's cool. It means that there is an energy there, there is a desire there. Maybe that's my own bubble, but I feel lots of energy in Ukrainian theater. Maybe I will still have some inferiority complexes in Ukrainian theater towards world theater, but come on, if you look at, of course, it's understandable that in Great Britain they have great people, great bands, great works. But if you look at some average theater, it's also not extremely awesome. So in Ukraine, we already have lots of very competitive projects, and I think that we will have only more of them, and their quality will only grow. So I believe that everything will be amazing. Thanks a lot to all speakers. Thank the audience for your imagination and attention, for your questions. What is left for me is just to emphasize, to stress those ideas that we have heard from speakers, that from your time, from your imagination and attention, we can have dialogue and we can have possibilities concerning our future. Thank you for attention. Good luck.
Доброго дня. Дякуємо тим, хто залишився тут. Ми сьогодні маємо таку публічну розмову в рамках цієї сцени.
Welcome back. So we are starting our conversation with Kyrylo Karabets, a conductor, a person spending a lot of time on stage. Kyrylo became a conductor quite early when he was only 19 years old, and since then he has been managing a huge musical body, which is an orchestra. So today we are going to be discussing this dimension of imagining the future in classics from the standpoint of a person who is creating this classics, who is co-creating this classics in action with a large number of people, and who is contributing their own vision into this creation and reinterpreting classical music pieces for contemporary audience, actualizing them constantly. And Kyrylo has to be one of the most famous Ukrainian conductors in the world, and probably one of the youngest. And he's managing an orchestra in Dortmund since 2008. We have already discussed some of the topics we could touch upon within the Culture Congress together with Kyrylo, and we have outlined a number of topics So I will start from some personal questions. So the year of pandemic stripped many artists of the ability to be present on stage. And this year has created a wonderful opportunity for those who have a packed concert schedule and packed professional life to slow down and rethink themselves in the profession. And has this year been the same for you? Yes, it has been. When you introduced me, you told that I tried being a conductor as early as I was 19 years old, but I always remember that my teacher, Levkova Nedektovon, told me, who said that conducting is very difficult for the first 30 years, and then gradually it gets easier and easier. So probably I am soon achieving this limit in several years, the 30-year mark. So I'm expecting for conducting to become easier, because conducting on the one hand is a glamorous affair if you look from the outside, but in reality, conductors and their life is something very special, because you basically have no life in the normal sense of living a life in a specific place, having friends. So conductors don't have this, because we constantly travel, we constantly change between orchestras. We travel to different countries with different mentalities, different mental codes that you need to find keys to. You need to find ways to communicate using different languages, and it happens constantly. Excuse me for deviating from the question. Yes, but you are practically answering what I asked you about, because the pandemic has changed our way of life. And here, the pandemic, which has stopped everything, it has created a vacuum, and looking back at the previous year and a half, I have spent this time for myself, and I just wanted to understand who I was in reality, what my identity was, what made me different from other people, and it was my main objective. And I decided, for practically being a conductor for 25 years, I've been living under such pressure which did not allow me to slow down. Constant concerts, constant traveling, constant stress. It's non-stop, and you get used to it so much that the dream of the day coming when everything will stop and you will just have time to sit down and think, not being in a hurry for rehearsal, that day has come unexpectedly, and it gave me an opportunity to think about who I am, what my identity as a conductor is, why I am the way I am, and who I would like to become in the future, and what I need to do to achieve that. Have you found any new answers or insight because you didn't have enough active public life? So what were the new things you've discovered about yourself? I can answer in the following way. I haven't discovered anything new. I realized again that I like who I am, and I would like to continue moving forward in the same direction I have already taken. So that's the unexpected answer I can give. Of course, it's quite superficial, but in reality, I do something that I enjoy, and that's again the conclusion I arrived at. Of course, we are not yet out of the woods. The orchestras and the conductors are not yet out of this pandemic, so we are practically entering another wave. Yes, we don't know what will happen exactly, but it doesn't really matter. I'm certain who I want to continue to be as a conductor. We talked a lot, especially last year, that the culture and people representing the cultural industry and performative professions suffered the most, and it was quite evident how different genres of art were trying to reinvent themselves, and a lot was written and said about the pandemic being the catalyst for the processes which were accumulating before it, for those processes to be launched. So we thought a lot about creating horizontal links during the previous 7 years, about ways in which creative items could interact, and I think it's quite relevant for orchestras. We also spoke a lot about decentralization, especially under the condition within a large national teams of artists, as a symphonic orchestra is a large structure. So the usual hierarchies have been built on the idea that there is somebody on top who knows what to do, and that's why we do it in the way we're doing it. The conductor tells us what to do, or the Minister of Culture tells us what we should do. The pandemic and the threat to our health, which was very close to all of us, it reshifted our attention to people who were at the center of all of it. So if some members of your orchestras fall ill, then you have no chances to implement your high-flown ideas. So how has the pandemic impacted your work within the team? You have already had meetings after the beginning of the pandemic. So how have the relationships inside the orchestra changed, and how has your position as a conductor changed? There are very many different teams, and they are all different. Some orchestras are used to conductors, dictators, because they don't suggest any ideas. There are very democratic orchestras where during the first rehearsal already, you don't know them yet, they already come up with suggestions and interesting ideas that you can work with. So a conductor, especially in the format in which they are traveling, a conductor cannot change themselves within 5-10 minutes, but they need to adjust to the team that they are to work with. So this is a very thin line as to whether you should follow what the orchestra wants and to what degree you should be true to yourself. For me, the value of conducting, sorry, I'm again deviating from the question, but I will eventually answer what you asked me about. So, for me, a conductor is a person who needs to perform their function very clearly, and the same goes for everybody else who is involved in the creation of music that we are all looking for. We are looking for music which creates energy, which unites us, and which gives us an opportunity to communicate without speaking, which creates such an energetic setting, which is the most valuable. So in this process, the conductor performs a specific function, just like the musician or a member of the audience do. Creation and search for this music is a very democratic process, because if I have prepared and I have decided how this music should sound, this is no longer democracy. It's just not interesting. But yet we have very many conductors who do it exactly in this manner, as I've just described. They need to suggest their own concept and they need to make everybody follow it. And then we understand that the conductor is an individual, we understand who they are. I'm not interested in these things. So can we say that this is the old school that you are describing, or have we always had conductors like that throughout history? But in Europe there are very many orchestras, even nowadays, which don't understand another language. It's very complicated to work with them because they are expecting for the conductor to be a kind of dictator in the way they communicate with the orchestra members. But I have a clear understanding that I'm not interested in working like that. I don't want to get ready to have everything put down in writing, how everything should sound, how high, how low, how quick the music should sound. So I'm not interested in implementing the concept I have pre-developed. So how do you do when you have to work with orchestras used to this style of working with the conductor? I first put on a mask. I'm not always successful in doing that, but at the very beginning, initially when I'm not familiar with the orchestra members, I try to adapt to their style so that they become more honest a little bit later. But I don't do that initially, because when I put off the mask at the very beginning, then nothing will happen, nothing will turn out of it, because people are used to a different language. But this style of communication is not my priority in conducting. When we start a concert, we forget about everything. That's what I'm interested in. How do we find this formula which allows for us to be in this musical meditation? That's the only thing I'm interested in, and everything I'm doing during rehearsals is psychological preparation for this very moment. Because I've understood from my practice and experience that this is the most interesting and exciting thing. That's the thing that made me become a musician. Now that you've had this long pause and many musicians have longed for rehearsals, for concert halls and audiences, has the style of work changed? Was it easier for you to show up for rehearsals after the quarantine because people are longing for this co-creation, or have people lost the skill of common work? That depends on the orchestra. For instance, in England with my orchestra, I just came back yesterday. The day before yesterday we had a concert, and they were very happy to have the opportunity to perform, that there were people in the audience who were applauding, and they were really happy. And they are open and they demonstrate that. And there are other orchestras in Europe, famous orchestras at that, which have forgotten this feeling, and it will take them some time, especially I'm speaking about routine orchestras that are used to schedules. They will need some time to come back and to regain this feeling. We are speaking about hierarchies and some ratios of power and pressure, or incentives to be creative. So you're working with orchestras in Europe and you're constantly working with your orchestra in England, and you've been working a lot in Ukraine recently, in Lviv in particular. So That is working with different mentalities, and musicians are people that don't live in a vacuum, they are part of the society, and we are speaking about the post-Soviet countries as post-totalitarian society, more used to a stronger leader and more imperative methods of work. How do you feel this difference in your work with musical teams? Can you say that there are some specific features that are connected to cultural background of musicians and the traditions, that Ukrainian orchestras are more eager to have a dictator conductor, or they are more open to have a conductor who is co-creator? Is it a tradition of a specific team? No, it's more about the team. Each team has its own special character. It's hard to say, but even in Europe there are completely opposite examples of how musicians treat the process of rehearsals and concerts, how they imagine themselves. If we compare German and English orchestras, they are total opposites. English orchestras like conductors who don't speak, who just show, who are very quick in finding a common language with them. And in Germany, musicians expect that the conductor will be explaining everything and telling them how it should sound and why it should sound like that. So you have to find completely different ways of communicating with teams. So here everything depends on a specific team and individual musicians. Is it predetermined by the individual musicians, or also by the fact who the previous conductor was? Both factors should be taken into account. Musicians are an important element. They all have their own personality, expectations, etc. And orchestras, if we look at them as a team playing together, when they do play together, they are already used to specific sounding, and that's already a tradition defined by the person who worked with the orchestra previously, and that is also reflected in the repertoire. So the age, is it taken into account? Young orchestras, are they more democratic than older? Yes, young orchestras are usually more open for honest communication. So I'm always happy to do conducting with young teams, because I don't need to wear the mask. I can be discreet. I can immediately jump into meditation without any preparation. About the degree of honesty and openness which has arrived because of the quarantine and COVID, because we have had a shift towards opening of our personal spaces, not because we were zooming from our own apartments and we could often see bookshelves behind the backs of the speakers or their kids. All of that reopened us as people. How comfortable are you as a manager in this position when everybody has become more human, if I can call it that? I feel that very many orchestras, especially permanent European orchestras, they had those Zoom concerts not to stop their activities, and they constantly having them even now, but they are tired of these things. It may be a good experiment for several months, but not for longer. I think it's a good thing because it gives us the understanding how valuable face-to-face communication is and physical presence of music. Do you feel any changes in the audience in this respect? Because we said that we are now again cherishing the moment of coexistence because we will have less audience. And people organizing concerts are now having problems with getting people together. People have lost the skill of attending concerts and they may be vary for their health. And it may be complicated to have a full house. And full house nowadays is half of the hall or even third of it, or just an orchestra being filmed by a video camera. So do you feel this difference? Full house is a full house, and 50% of the hall is 50%. But what I'd like to say that what has changed after the pandemic, and something that I'm clearly feeling, is that musicians are now required to produce music on a quality level, because people want more profound communication. They want to be even closer to music, and that gives us the task to be even more open, to find the tools that will immediately reach the hearts and souls of people who come to the concerts. Another story which has to do with the silent government authorities pre-pandemic. So we have different Me Too movements and similar movements which are part of the cancel culture. So has anything of that type happened in classical music? Because cinema has suffered the most and performative arts were the most involved, the people coming onto stage. And classics is quite a conservative sphere and also one which is connected to hierarchy, where there are some positions of power. We know that it's complicated to get in a good orchestra, and there's severe competition between musicians, and this sphere has the tendency to be manipulated by power. So has classics been affected by this situation? You're right when saying that classics is very conservative, and I think it will become even more conservative after the pandemic. But the change that I'm feeling is that everyone has come back to their own self, to their local city, to their native country, to their identity, because even technically it's impossible to travel. It's hard to travel, because if previously we could travel between Paris and London easily, nowadays the tests and all the other requirements impede fast traveling. So each country has focused on its own conductors and musicians, and this link with your native country, with your roots, is very important nowadays to develop. We understand this, and in the context of Ukraine, I can say that nobody is interested in us but for us. This is an exaggeration, but there's a grain of truth to it. We need to find the link with our own country, with our own audience that likes us and attends our concerts. Do you feel that there is a demand in Ukraine for ourselves? Because we felt this demand after 2013, 2014, when you were conducting the concert during the celebrations of the Independence Day, and people were inspired post-revolution, and everybody was interested in discovering themselves. I'm feeling that, but I also feel that people are demanding quality product. Here it is very important, if we look at the orchestras and the programs, it is very important at the current stage to produce quality, to produce a product that will result in quality communication. I hope that you understand what I was trying to say.
You have had lots of concerts during the last year in Ukraine, and in your spring interview you say that with every year you feel yourself Ukrainian more and more. So how it is connected with what you were just talking about, that pandemic kind of limited us a little bit and we all get back to our roots, because you do not live in Ukraine, you live in France and you work in England, you travel everywhere. What is that central X for you that bring Kyrylo Karabits back to Ukraine, to Ukrainian orchestras? You know, as any type of person, I'm looking for myself. I'm looking for my identity. And when I say that I'm looking for myself, I mean that I am looking for Ukrainian culture, Ukrainian music. I am looking for answer, what is Ukrainian music? Can we consider Sergei Prokofiev? I have talked a lot about this already. Whether we can consider Tchaikovsky a Ukrainian composer. Yes, we can, and we have to do this. So that's basically in the same interview you have this perfect phrase of yours that I can do more than any politician, and it was about Prokofiev. Yes, Prokofiev, because it's very close topic for me. Such a small example, when I became a main conductor in England, the first project that I suggested was to record all symphonies by Prokofiev, and the focus was actually on where Prokofiev is from. So that's why we wrote his early works together with symphonies, to show his roots, to show where these great symphonists appeared from. And it was the series that lasted for several years, and it was very interesting for me to read. And at the very end, English critics in Guardian Times, for example, they were talking about Prokofiev as Ukrainian composer. And was it a milestone for you? It could have been done in a very non-conflicted way, but we have it, and it should be like this. And it's a very political accentuation focusing, because if you are on international stage or with Russian musicians, you definitely has to focus, to emphasize on it. And it looks from your biography that usually you do this with the help of material you're working with the content. Yes, what kind of policy is here? You know, Prokofiev considered himself Ukrainian. When he went to the USA, he had some problems with the documents, and he has said that I don't know how Americans, it's his quotation, I don't know how Americans are going to treat Russian separatists, but I was born in Ukraine. It's his quotation. He mentioned this. So when Ukrainian composer Kyrylo Karabits is performing Prokofiev, then it's just returning to myself. I'm just conducting a composer whose music is close for me, whose music brings me inspiration, and I want to share this inspiration with others. There is no politics here. it's important to understand what we mean by politics here. But I do not. I have no party affiliation, and the essence of recording those symphonies was just to share with the world something that connects me with Prokofiev. When you get invitation or when you meet colleagues at some international platforms, when you face with Russian composers or conductors or orchestras, do you think about your self-positioning? Yes, of course. I never, especially when I communicate with Russian musicians and conductors, I always emphasize that I'm Ukrainian conductor. And even more, I communicate only with those musicians who understand and appreciate this. After 2013, did it actualize? So it was always like that. How this coexistence in classical sphere looked like? Because definitely it changed after the beginning of war. Do you mean with Russia? Yes, are you still invited? And you were invited afterwards? Yes, but in that sense that I am more careful with who I am communicating right now. And if till 2014 I was in big theater, then I kind of emphasized a circle of my communication with those people who I would like to continue communicating. So one of parts of your activity is also building those those barriers and in this coexistence and with colleagues. How has it changed? It is always changing, but from the beginning of my work, I always have wanted to be equal, whether it's friends, when I conduct friends' music, I maybe add some moments connected with Ukrainian mentality, or so my activity is based on this. So from the very beginning, I have told to myself, I am Ukrainian conductor, and I have certain traditions. I was studying in Kyiv, so I am a representative of a Ukrainian school of director. It's an interesting question, what is a Ukrainian school of directors, but that's a different topic for a talk. And in whenever context I'm in, whatever context I'm in whatever country I'm in, I always remember about that. But at the beginning of your professional way, you go to Europe and you start returning to Ukraine later. Was it a conscious move, or it just happened so? You know, I have never left Ukraine. In 18, I started moving around the world, and it was very fashionable, and now it's more difficult to go study to Europe or to move to Europe. I also had such my personal story, because I was a son of a composer, so for me, as I understood later, it was important to get rid of this connection father-son. I wanted to become independent, and that's why at the beginning my career was pretty interesting. I was studying in Kyiv conservatory, and then in Vienna and in orchestra. So basically I was living among 3 countries. I knew all flight attendants, I knew their life stories. I was very happy to see them, because almost every week I was traveling either from Vienna to Kyiv or from Kyiv to Budapest, and it was very important psychological moment for me in my life. it's to become Kirill Karabets, who is different from his father. That's why it did not happen in Ukraine. But with the time, of course, I always have this wish to go back to Ukraine because you understand your roots. Your place of power, is it Kyiv? Kyiv, now in Lviv also, thanks to orchestra in song. But in Ukraine, yes, that's for sure. That way of life, when every day you have flights, when it's communication with orchestras in different countries, it's possible only now in modern world where we have such possibility of communication, where we have flights, but at the same time you are working in a very conservative sphere, in classic sphere. And there is a certain disruption between how modern conductor lives with what he is working with, and is it felt for you? And is it felt that classic should be actualized somehow right now, or that it needs to be adapted for modern audience, or it's not like this for you? You know, classic definitely has to be, always has to be adapted, but it does not mean that it has to be changed. It is as it is. You just need to look for new listeners, and you need to engage people with whom it's pleasant for you to work, who create that energetic, powerful situation that can. Because today the world is so not understandable, so confusing, and it is changing so fast that one person cannot change anything, cannot do anything, only a team. So in our sphere it's the same. That's why I have understood with the time that's what I'm interested in, to find to find people who think the same, to find people who you like spending time with, and people with whom you can have this deep sharing of energies and thoughts that can produce. And that's exactly what opened classical music for new public and finds this new public, new audience. This is what it was. Modern viewers should put aside they should put aside their gadget, or they should stop filming stories or taking pictures, but at the same time we always see pictures of involving we always see some attempts of involving digital benefits to create better effect on the stage and so on. So this digitalization and our involvement into digital world, does it prevent something, or it gives additional potential for perception? It is needed today. It's very difficult without it, but at the same time I understand that I have understood lately how tired I am from this digitalization. I just want to have open communication, so I basically do not so I cannot say that I get rid of, but I'm looking for other new forms of continuing this digitalization of my own activity, because I am tired of Facebook, of Instagram. I want live communication and deep communication, not through gadgets. I think that that's a great moment to for our Q&A session. We have an opportunity for maybe 1-2 questions, and we have very strict timing, and that's why we have to say goodbye, unfortunately. Yes, almost 1 hour has passed very fast. Thank you. It was extremely interesting to listen to you. I wanted to ask a little bit about the beginning of our discussion. We were talking about not, let's say, about differentiation between conductor and an orchestra. And it was interesting for me how to understand, how it is possible to understand what is the orchestra, how the orchestra behaves, because we have people of different ages there, and it can be some young people who are still studying, and some almost pensioners. So how to understand this atmosphere and this understanding when orchestra has this common vision of its mission, of its aim, and basically of what the orchestra looks like. That's why we have conductor, because the conductor suggests trajectory of movement, and that which gathers everybody. It can be idea, it can be any some kind of particular sound. He has to suggest a way which will be used later for everybody. This way can change, but in this is the role of a conductor. He is some kind of a coordinator. He inspires and gives the opportunity to understand how to get from point A to point B. And that's the role of the conductor, to unite musicians. I also would like to express my gratitude for your work, for your extremely interesting theoretical approach to conducting with this aura of common activities. And I also would like to express my gratitude for your returning, for your identity. And I have a question, because we have been for 30 years we have been trying to find our own identity. Till that time, in our general Ukrainian space, it has not been formed, and that's why it does not look for me that we have lots of discussion that returning back to the past, it's not up to date, and we have to look into the future. But it seems to me that without that past, without that identity, without that dignity and cultural foundation on which the state grows, we cannot have any type of future. But in the connection to this, I wanted to ask how is Ukrainian music perceived? Let's go back to classic. How Ukrainian classic music is treated. I am extremely grateful for Prokofiev, but I also would like to ask how Ukrainian audience differs from the Western one, and how is Ukrainian music perceived and how it is known, because Ukraine is not identified as the country of high culture. We know lots of reasons. We know that it's part of Russia. Everything is Russia. So thank you for your answer, and good luck. I agree 100% that there is no future without the past. We cannot build a country without it. But we need to gather all Ukrainian that belonged either to Russian Empire or to Austro-Hungarian Empire. So we need to gather all of it and identify it as our culture. And at first it has to happen with us, and then we can move it to, we have to accept this and to understand who are we, and then we can talk about that with the world. 100% I agree with you, and that's why concerning Ukrainian music, unfortunately, it is not known. Unfortunately. I have recently started lobbying of several topics. First, that's the name of our famous composer Boris Litashinsky, who we also recorded in England his third symphony with great success. it was the opening of this composer basically in England. People cannot understand how it is possible that music of such level is not famous. And there are several more interesting names who are also part of Ukrainian music. Recently in Lviv we have performed his works. It's Fedor Yakimenko, who died in Paris, and he's absolutely forgotten. And we have lots of other names, but I do what I can do, but I do my best. And I am trying to find more systematic approach. There should be more systematic approach, which should happen at some level of cultural policy. Yes, I am not omnipotent. I am only one conductor. I am not omnipotent. I think that we have this Congress of Culture to um, create common ways of movement and lobbying and influence, and with cultural policy and for creation of such tools. We are grateful for your participation. Stay with us. We are going to have lots of interesting things in future. Кирило Карабець.
Я щиро дякую пану Кирилу і Євгенії Несторович. Євгенія викладачка Українського католицького університету, а також журналістка і критикиня, можна так казати, що ви знайшли можливість і так само долучилися до нашого конгресу. Зараз я тільки хочу нагадати, що Конгрес культури «Сцена майбутнього» організований Інститутом стратегії культури та громадською організацією Вірменська 35, став можливий завдяки підтримці Львівської міської ради, Міжнародного фонду відродження, а також Jam Factory та Harold Binder Culture Enterprises Foundations, а також новій організації Фундація культурних стратегічних ініціатив. І я оголосила, що ми будемо без перерви, але ж ми тут для того, щоб створити фізичну близькість, то маємо 10 хвилин на те, щоб стати ближчими зараз в кулуарах. Наступна наша дискусія буде присвячена соціальним мережам і як оце в гонитві за лайками забезпечувати якісь зміни. І користуючись тим, що ми маємо можливість конструювати, деконструювати, змінювати цей простір, говорячи про цифрову агору, хочемо говорити знизу. Нам потрібно 10 хвилин на перекалібровку цього простору. Дякую вам і уважно, будь ласка, слухайтеся дзвінків. Дзвінки попередять, коли варто заходити. Ми все ж таки в театрі, і це ще раз нагода подякувати театру Лесі за співпрацю. Дякуємо і чекаємо.
Остапе, почнеш?
Ну, мені взагалі соцмережі як концепція, навіть не розчленовуючи їх на окремо Twitter, окремо Facebook, просто все те, що ми робимо в інтернеті в інформаційному сенсі. Якщо не рахувати нашу переписку, тому що переписка в месенджерах – це епістолярія, це те, як змінилось наше листування і наші спроби поговорити одне з одним. А те, що ми робимо в соцмережах, публікуючи якийсь контент і творячи якийсь контент, це новий спосіб публікуватися. Це наші газети. Це газета, яку кожен з нас відкриває і читає зранку.